thanks a lot. Maybe I should explain that Navy's undersea surveillance system. Nobody knows what that is, but it has had at that point facilities overseas in 5 different countries, and the cables laid on the ocean bottom had acoustic sensors, and with that system we could track submarines around the world. So it was a lot of fun, pretty sophisticated, and that's kind of what got me into the cable business. So after I went to the commercial industry side of things, I was able to serve on this International Cable Protection Committee for about 15 years, which was a lot of fun. So all the things that, like if you were going to call London, that doesn't go through a satellite. That goes on this cable that runs along the ocean floor, comes up somewhere in England, gets transferred to a landline, and then you're talking to somebody in London. And that's how it generally works across the world. Probably 95% of the world's communications are handled through that system. And so the only people that get to use a satellite are like the president and Putin and those guys. So we don't rate satellites, we rate the landlines. I want to talk a little bit today about our responsibility kind of environmentally to the Earth. There's a lot of news today about a lot of different subjects that talk about the things that we're going to address kind of very briefly. And we'll kind of start large scale and then kind of work down to your neighborhood. Got it. Now, if you look at Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, it says that during creation the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. That's kind of our first direction on our responsibility, our relationship with the earth that we've inherited. We inherited it from our parents, and that we can blame them for all our problems, or we can look at it ourselves and say, how do I contribute to what we're going to do next? You know, if you look at the Colorado River, as it goes through the upper reaches of the Colorado, it's a raging torrent. There's water everywhere. When it gets to the Sea of Cortez in northern Mexico, it's a bit of a trickle. What you're seeing there is a buoy that's laying on dry land, and the buoy says, slow down. Well, unless you're driving an SUV, you're not going to see that buoy from a boat. And that's kind of the issue. We have taken the Colorado River and we bored holes and we send the water to the North Platte, we send the water to the Rio Grande. We send water everywhere but its original channel, which actually goes through California and ends up in the Sea of Cortez. And the amount of water that is used for irrigation and other human resources is huge. So that when it gets to the Sea of Cortez, it's but a trickle of its original size. Now, you say, well, we used all that water for a good purpose. The question you have to ask yourself is, what happens to that environment in the northern Sea of Cortez, which is basically built for thousands of years on this huge torrent of water that empties into the Sea of Cortez? Now you have very little fresh water emptying into the Sea of Cortez. So what's the impact of that? It's an interesting question. And one of the things that you'll find out is if you read, there's a fellow called Solomon, Old Testament guy, king of Israel, who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And one of the things he wrote was that our relationship, kind of the idea of the environmental cycle, let's say. And he wrote in chapter 1, all the streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. Now just think about that for a little bit. But what if the opposite happened? What if none of the streams flowed into the ocean because we used up all the water? That's probably never going to happen. But the environmental impact of that human use of the water has a huge impact on that environmental ecosystem that's been developed in that area where that water meets the ocean. It becomes brackish. There's a lot of life forms that depend on that less saline water for its life cycle. And then as you move out, it gets more saline, and you have a different life cycle in there. So we disrupt this life cycle, we're going to disrupt that entire ecosystem. And I don't know if we know what it looks like before we took all the water out of the Colorado, but today it's having a serious impact on that. Let's talk about energy use for a moment. How many of you have a cell phone? Yeah, that's universal now, isn't it? How do you put power into it? You charge it, right? You either plugged on or plugged in the whole time. Now, if you look at time over the last several generations, energy use in the early 1900s was extremely limited. A lot of people didn't even have electricity in their homes. You drove a Model T or a Model A. They were pretty crude instruments. Half the people rode horses. Today, nobody rides a horse. Everybody has a phone. Everybody has electricity. And you look at that and you go, well, what is our consumption rate? Now, there's a lot of, shall we say, consternation today in your generation over energy. Coal has been rejected because of its carbon content, impact on the environment. Nuclear has been rejected because of its potential risks, of which there have been very few. The oil and gas industry is under great political and environmental stress because of things like the oil spill in the Gulf. But you use it every day in your car. You get in your car, you fill it with gas, and you drive it around, and you don't even think about it, do you? But that's the kind of fuel that you're using that comes from that oil well offshore. Now, you don't like the harvesting of oil because of its potential risks, but you have no problem driving the car which uses the oil. We got to connect those two thoughts because they're inextricably linked. Now, what's the future look like? You can look at gas as the new darling of the energy industry, but if we convert everything to gas, you'll see buses around town with now, powered by natural gas signs on them and things like that. We could convert all your cars to natural gas. We could convert power plants to natural gas. All commercial power then goes to natural gas. How long will natural gas last? That's the question that you have to ask yourself. And is that worth the conversion? So, there are some risks associated with that. So let's think of the next thing, which is renewable power, right? Solar power is inexhaustible. Look at the ocean. Man, we can reap all that energy from the waves. Look at wind. We can, wind is blowing all the time. But you have to ask yourself, like you did at the Colorado River, what's the impact of taking all that water out of that river? Now, what's the impact of taking all that energy out of wind, all that energy out of waves, all that energy out of tidal power, and converting it to our use? How much can we take, and what's the impact of what we take? Nobody knows. It's never been done, not just now being looked at. So, every time we come up with a solution, there's a myriad of problems that go along with it. What's the real problem with energy? Is it the resource and where it comes from? Or is it how much we use? That's the question that you have to ask yourself. And is there any way that you can impact its use? Realistically. As an individual, as a group, or as a group of groups. Okay? So we've got some hard questions that we have to ask ourselves. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So we've got to figure out how to look at this from a conservation, change, and how do we help? How can we make a difference? Those are really the questions that we need to start asking ourselves. So let's look at water. Let's we did the Colorado River. A couple of things that you're seeing up here are, there's a beach on a beautiful island, and what do you see? A lot of trash. Now, is that just ocean waste? Is that just, seaweed piling up there? No, I see a lot of plastic. And here's the classic example of today's plastic market. Everybody in the world bottles water. Now, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but when I grew up, I drank water out of a garden hose when I was outside. Everybody today carries a bottle of water. What usually happens when the bottle is empty? Throw it away. Now, let's recycle. Okay, well here's a startling fact for you, and that is that China, who has been for the last probably 10 or 15 years importing all the recycling, and they're reusing it, right? So the thing that you get that says made in China is probably made out of your thrown away water bottle. The problem is, a couple months ago, China said, wait a minute, we're not going to accept your recycled waste anymore because it's so full of trash that we can't sort it out. So from an environmental standpoint, we can't even figure out how to recycle our own waste in order for it to be reusable. That's a trademark on our society today. We can't even throw stuff away reasonably well. So now, all this stuff floating around in the water out there, let's bring it all the way back to the Chesapeake Bay, which is just over there, okay? For years, the Chesapeake Bay was dying and dying rapidly. We had an oyster population that if you rowed across the Chesapeake, you would run your rowboat aground on a reef of oyster shells. That's how many oysters were in the Chesapeake Bay. It is recorded that John Smith couldn't even navigate the Chesapeake Bay on his big boat, sailboat. They had to get out and take the rowboats because the oysters were so dense that there wasn't a waterway that he could use, that he knew about, okay? So today, we're hard-pressed to find oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. And there's a very complex ecosystem out there. But there are some things happening today that are somewhat encouraging. When we begin to think about some of these things, and you look around the community and people are doing things about it, there are kids in classrooms that are growing oysters, little bitty oysters. And then they turn those over to the oystermen, who take them out in boats and plant them, basically. Now, the problem in the Chesapeake is that the bottom is, it's a waterway where throughout the middle eastern United States, everything goes through the Chesapeake. So the erosion and the materials being deposited in the Chesapeake Bay are horrendous. It's crazy, the amounts. Well, the first oysters that were planted just basically on the bottom, and how long did they last? They died immediately because they got overwhelmed by the mud bees. Okay, so then they had to figure out how to plant oysters up above the mud bottom so that they could actually grow. The next oysters they planted them on like cement pyramids. And so they planted the oysters there. They grew great until the manta rays showed up and they said, hors d'oeuvres, oysters on a half shell. This is perfect. They ate all the oysters. So we tried lots of things that would work very well, but they keep trying. So today, these little kids grow the oysters. They turn them over to the oystermen. The oystermen take them out and put them on actual banks of oysters so that they're above the mud line, and they actually grow. They're doing pretty well. And they are restoring the James, the Elizabeth rivers, I forgot the third river up the coast, but up the bay. But all those rivers are being restored by oysters that these kids are growing, and they're planting and restoring that oyster population. So if you got to the James and the Elizabeth rivers today, you can actually fish in it. You can actually eat the fish, and that's how much healthier the rivers are becoming. So are they making a difference? Yes. These little school kids growing oysters and handing them to the fishermen who have got to plant them is making a difference in our environment. The other thing that's happening is, if you go up the eastern shore